The Enlightenment was the invention of patriarchal white European men. Has anybody not heard that claim lately?
The original Enlightenment spirit was entirely right. It was deeply skeptical. It was deeply humble.
We ought to have fewer children dying. It's good to have fewer people dying. It's evil to let kids die if you can prevent it.
You didn't need the Enlightenment to produce that.
When cosmopolitanism fails and the good wishes of the West don't apply to certain people, philosophers and ethicists assert, well, we need more rigid rules of universal thought. We don't take the error and the failure as information itself.
These means to progress have become ends in themselves. Think about economic growth, something that we strive just for the sake of it.
What do all the people I would call woke, and I'm not going to list them here because invariably someone will say, Judith Butler isn't woke, or Ibram X. Kendi isn't woke, or I don't know if anybody would say that. There are important differences. You're blurring the differences between them all. Well, there's one thing that they all have in common. They think the Enlightenment ruined everything, okay? By the way, this Goya picture is called The Sleep of Reason, and Goya scholars don't know how to interpret it because the question is, the sleep of reason produces nightmares. The question is it reason producing the nightmares, or is it reason having fallen asleep that's producing the nightmares? I am not sure I have a take on it, but it's a great picture. I used it as a cover for a book 20 years ago. All of them think, and you probably heard it, that the Enlightenment was the invention of patriarchal white European men who wanted to use a set of ideas to dominate the rest of the world and bamboozle them in the process. Has anybody not heard that claim lately? No, it has gone so far as to seem obvious to people that at the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, which is just about to celebrate Kant's 300th birthday, everybody kind of agrees with it. Oh, yeah, I guess, well, can we save anything? It's not true. And really all you have to do to see that it's not true is to read, don't even bother with some of the difficult works of the Enlightenment. Read Candide. It's short. It's snappy. And you won't find a better condemnation of feudal hierarchies, racism, slavery, colonialism. It's all there. Now, this guy doesn't look like my kind of a hero, right? His name is Christian Wolff, and he was the most famous philosopher in Germany between Leibniz and Kant, okay? But when the post-colonialists decry Eurocentrism, they're taking an idea that came from the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment were the first people to argue that we need to look at Europe. Well, first of all, we need to look at the world not only from European eyes, and we can criticize Europe on the basis of other countries, okay? And they were just risking Twitter storms for doing this. Christian Wolff read some Confucius and some Mencius, and he decided and said publicly, they're not Christians, but they're perfectly moral people. I don't see anything wrong with the Chinese. And for this, he was ordered not only to leave his university job, but the entire state of Prussia in 1723. within 48 hours, or he would have been hung.
The core argument is that unfettered reason leads individuals to come to agreement about questions regarding the good life. In other words, unfettered reason, or what Steve calls the escalator of reason, leads us toward truth. It leads us towards agreement on first principles, and therefore we make moral and political progress. My argument is that unfettered reason involving lots of individuals does not lead to agreement. In fact, it leads to significant disagreement. People cannot agree about first principles. They cannot agree about questions regarding the political goods. They cannot agree about questions regarding justice, and therefore you're not making moral and political progress. And in fact, this is why politics is so important. If you look at Steve's work, politics is not very important because he believes that in the end, you're getting large-scale agreement on these central questions. My argument is you don't get central agreement, you get disagreement. And sometimes that disagreement is so fervent that people end up killing each other.
I think it's an exaggeration to say that no one agrees with anyone else on any first principle. If you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, every country, 193 countries, agreed on which way the world ought to go. That is, poverty should be reduced, safety should be increased, access to clean water should be increased, child death should be decreased, infectious disease should be decreased. There's an awful lot of agreement, and then we can reframe other arguments as what will get us to the state that many of us agree on. Now, again, not everyone. There are some people who have messianic visions that the world is not going to be a great place until everyone obeys all of God's commandments. And if kids die, so it doesn't matter one way or another. But to the extent that people do agree that babies dying is bad, and by and large they do, then that changes the argument from disagreements over first principles to disagreements over means to the end.
I just don't think, Steve, there's any disagreement on issues of safety, health, and sustenance. That's not the issue. We're talking about moral and political principles here. We're talking about first principles, what comprises the good life. That's where the real disagreement is.
Wait, I guess I'm not seeing that. Isn't fewer children dying a moral principle? That is, that we ought to have fewer children dying. It's good to have fewer people dying. It's evil to let kids die if you can prevent it.
No, I think that's so obvious as to not even be interesting. I mean,
but wait a second. But then those are first principles that everyone agrees on.
You didn't need the Enlightenment to produce that, right? The argument here is the Enlightenment and using our critical faculties changed things. We were finally able to make moral and political progress. I think from time immemorial, people have understood that, young children dying is a bad thing. And what we should do is try and keep them alive for as long as possible.
Well, but we did have things like, slavery and human sacrifice and genocide of other peoples. And we had, praying to avert famine as opposed to developing vigorous hybrids and artificial fertilizers and crop rotation. So the means to attain those differed as well. But even the idea of universal human flourishing, that isn't so obvious. One could you go back into a lot of religious codes, and the idea that every last member of Homo sapiens ought to flourish, isn't there.
I think, Steve, that there is a large element of triumphalism in your book. And in fact, when I read it carefully, I couldn't help but think about Frank Fukuyama's very famous article, The End of History, which was published in 1989.
I think that, just to state the obvious, we're in a very different period than when my original article and book came out. Democracy at that point was expanding very rapidly, and it's been in retreat over the last, I would say, almost 20 years now, really since about 2008. And I think that retreat has been accelerating, especially with Donald Trump taking office in the United States. I would say of all the unexpected things that have happened The fact that you could get this much regression and that Americans could vote for a demagogue like Trump is something I really wouldn't have anticipated. But, the book was really not about any kind of short-term prediction about political events. The concept of the end of history was not mine. It was really the philosopher Georg Hegel that articulated it, and it was used then by Karl Marx. Both of them believed that history was directional, that there was progress, that societies evolved and changed over time. And the question of the end of history was, to what sort of society were they progressing? And Hegel's was basically a liberal society coming out of the French Revolution, and Karl Marx's answer was a communist utopia. And my point back in 1989 was that the Marxist version of the end of history did not look like it was going to happen, and if anything, we were going to end up with a liberal state. And I think that there's still a lot to be said for this, because you need to step back a little bit from current events. Since the Hegelian Declaration, we've had a lot of things happening in the world, but over the past couple of hundred years, since the French and American revolutions, the fundamental idea that a modern society needs to be based on an equality of recognition has really been accepted by virtually everybody. There are very few people that say, systematically, this race or this particular group is superior to every other one. And the other foundation has to do with economics, that liberal societies tend to be the richest societies in the world. Even China today, which is not a liberal political order, has adopted important parts of economic liberalism, and that really has a lot to do with why they're as rich as they are today. And so the question really that I was trying to address is whether there's an alternative form of social organization that is higher than a liberal democracy connected to a market economy. And, to this point, I haven't seen it, although we're obviously not, making a lot of progress in terms of liberal democracy at the moment.
What, if anything, should replace the Enlightenment and the dream of objective knowledge?
Nothing. There's nothing wrong with it in the first place. It was obviously the beginning of a project which continues. So obviously there are things those early Enlightenment philosophers got wrong. But, when I hear people talking about the end of the Enlightenment dream and sort of how, we have to give up on objective knowledge and the belief in the human power of reason to understand everything, blah, 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 I'm thinking, well, which Enlightenment philosophers are we actually talking about here? I mean, if we remember some of the most important, Kant, right? I'm not a Kantian, but, Kant believed that the world in itself was completely unknowable. And we can only know the world of the phenomenal world, as he called it. So there's naive realism? Absolutely not. The exact opposite. Hume, I think the greatest Enlightenment philosopher was David Hume. He did not believe that we could even know with any certainty that one thing causes another, even though belief in the power of causation is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of the world and our ability to reason scientifically. He was a deep skeptic about reason. He was reacting against Descartes, and particularly Descartes, rationalist philosophers who believed that by the pure power of the intellect alone, all of reality would become manifest and certain. Now that rationalist dream was dead, but it was killed by the Enlightenment philosophers, right? Who said that in its place is something much more modest, empirical knowledge, which lacks any kind of absolute certainty whatsoever. It's absolutely provisional and cannot penetrate until the deepest levels of reality. So the original Enlightenment spirit was entirely right. It was deeply skeptical. It was deeply humble about the capacities of human knowledge. And if some people have taken that legacy and got an inflated idea of the power of human reason, etc., well, that's their problem, not the Enlightenment. So I think it's go back to the founding, the best thinkers of the Enlightenment, continue their projects with the benefit of contemporary knowledge they didn't have. So, for example, I think the greatest thing was the thing that people like Hume and Kant didn't realize so much was about psychology, actually. Empirical psychology has come along a long way since then. So we are much more aware of the very specific ways in which human reason is fallible and distorted and so forth. So we build on that, and that's all part of the Enlightenment project.
Okay, a stirring defence of a particular brand of Enlightenment thought. Hilary, do you endorse that? It'd be made for a poor debate if you do, so I'm hoping you don't.
Yes, well, actually, unfortunately, there are aspects of that I am going to agree with, but let me put the counter to get us off onto the right footing. I think that the modernist fantasy that we're gradually uncovering a complete understanding of the world is over. I don't think that's going to happen. But I don't think this means that we are at the end of the Enlightenment or even at the beginning of the end of the Enlightenment, although perhaps we're at the end of the beginning of the Enlightenment. Why has all of that happened? Why has this been undermined? Well, I think it's largely about perspectives, and we've become increasingly aware of the importance of cultural, historical perspectives and language, of course, critically language, and indeed even our biology. So there's no Archimedean point from which we can see the world and see it somehow truly. We're stuck with a radically perspectival world, and that means we're not going to be able to reach through to an ultimate way of holding things. But I don't think that is as serious as some people think, because the real value of the Enlightenment, I think, was in the strategies of observation and reason. And those strategies enable us to refine our models, refine our narratives about the world, and help them to work more effectively toward the goal that they were designed for, that we wanted for them.
We take as given that there are certain goods in the world. We think that ethics sets an objective set of rules that we can follow to arrive at these ends. But we have to deal with a stark reality, which is that most of the ideas of universalism drawn from the Germanic tradition and the Scottish Enlightenment come about either as a justification for conducting colonial expansion and empire, creating groups of people who are not seen as human, who don't possess this sensibility of good values, or, as Gabriel suggests in his work, as an answer, as a return to escape the rampant and radical identity politics of our time, to come up to an agreed upon order. Now, Baldwin allows us to see something very, very clearly. He articulates the problem of a value, one that is said to be agreed upon throughout the Western world: equality, liberty, freedom, brotherhood, etc. But when those values are practiced or uttered by people who are outside of the West, outside of Europe, who are not allegedly blessed with the light and melanin lacking skin of everyone else, it becomes treason and terror. So we understand then that universal values arise not as an intuitive sensibility of how you think about the world, but rather as an aspiration of how you want the world to look. Said differently, there's never been any empirical substantiation that there are values that everyone in the world holds that are true and generalizable, that are not affected by language and cultural difference. But in times of conflict and disruption, ethicists, philosophers assert that reflective judgments about the world and the failures of democracy can be resolved through universalist proposals such as the golden rule or deontological ethics, or dare I say a more rigid moral realism. So these universal propositions animate ideal perpetrators and victims of atrocities. They imagine that despite the failure of the world, despite the failure of democracy to prevent horror, to stop young people from being slaughtered, young black men slaughtered in the streets of the United States, unable to protect people in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When cosmopolitanism fails and the good wishes of the West don't apply to certain people, philosophers and ethicists assert, well, we need more rigid rules of universal thought. We don't take the error and the failure as information itself. So these assertions then of how one should act are then presented as observable facts. We say, well, we should think this. We should see everybody as a human being. We should value equality. We should have every life, be it black, brown, Muslim, etc., count the same as a white life. But that's not the world that we actually live in.
The Enlightenment occurred at a particular historical moment in this history of European expansion and European hegemony. It wasn't necessarily responsible for it, but it most definitely intersected with it. But European hegemony is also a historical phenomenon that needs to be explained historically. It's not a given. Neither the emergence of European hegemony nor the persistence of European hegemony are historical givens. Historians, our whole job is to question everything, why change over time happens. But I think Janet Abu-Lughod's book is an important place to start, and this map of intersecting spheres of trade, commerce, intellectual exchange, because it shows us Europe on the periphery of a very dynamic intellectual, cultural, and economic world system. And if the ideas of the Enlightenment emerged in Europe at a particular place in time, it was in part because of Europe's increasing attempts to break into this world system and gain access to the dynamism that is happening elsewhere in the world, in which Europe is sort of a poor cousin of the intellectual, philosophical, moral, cultural developments that are happening throughout this Afro-Eurasian world system that she describes in the 1300s. So the very first question that I would ask is, was the Enlightenment European? And I think most recent scholarship on the Enlightenment emphasizes not that it was something that occurred in a vacuum in Europe, but that rather every human culture and society has developed technology, and every human culture and society has engaged in rational thought. And that one of the things that Europe learned from other societies and cultures, and that includes the important role of Islam, and I'm going to show you lots of books in this presentation, Islamic thought, Islamic science, that Europeans coming out of their dark ages were exposed to, that sparked new questions for Europeans, and also expansion into the Americas, where Europeans were exposed to ideas, Native American ideas from North America, as David Graeber and David Wengrow argue in The Dawn of Everything about the influence of Native American thought on Europeans, and Latin American thought. And I just include here a 17th century translation of a very famous and much read in Europe Inca account of Inca history and society that opened Europeans' eyes to, oh, the way things here aren't the only way that things could be.
They don't have a clear vision of progress. Progress was an ideology that was born in the beginning of the 19th century. And as any ideology is a set of ideas that sometimes we put together and we pick and choose. Some of those ideas were, for example, development of the economic sector, so free trade, economic progress. And that economic progress was tied to the idea of property and the endless frontier. We also thought in progressive politics that is tied to technology. The advancement of science. However, this means to progress have become ends in themselves. Think about economic growth, something that we strive just for the sake of it and is part of this progressive ideology from the 19th century. So we have lost the idea of what is progressive because we don't know what progress is. It is an ideology that is tied to a kind of a linear understanding that there's an end. And in the 19th century, that end was the common good. After the 19th century, the common good was just eliminated basically from the idea of progress because we could not agree what the common good is. So without understanding what we have in common and what we want, then it's very difficult to be progressive, I would say.
The first thing I'd like to say is that progress is in the eye of the beholder. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about a singular concept of progress. Progress for the bourgeoisie or the wealthy is quite different from progress from the perspective of a commoner. And our history is defined by the constitutional documents of 1217 that we were discussing before. The Magna Carta came into existence in November 1217, as did the Charter of the Forest. And they defined progress in terms of the rights of the commoners in the commons. The right to subsistence, the rights to the means of production, the rights to common, the rights to habitat. So progress for the commoners was measured in those terms. And if you look back through our history, all the great struggles have been about the commoners demanding progress in access to the right to work, to the right to the commons. You go to the Peasants' Revolt, you go to Kett's Rebellion, you go to the levelers and the diggers of the 17th century, you go through to the Chartists, you go through to the William Morris arts and crafts. It's always been about trying to recover the sense of commoning, the sense of a right to work and a right to leisure in the ancient Greek sense of that term. And we've lost many of those issues.
Did we ever have a unified view of progress? Whether it's Marxists, social liberals, classical liberals, and others have advanced alternative and often competing ideas of what constitutes progress. And we're hearing that play out here today. Do we need a unified view of progress to improve society? And lastly, what timeline are we looking at? If you take the string of time between Magna Carta and 1928, and if you are an alien from outer space and you land on these isles, you would think this democracy was lacking because it was only in 28 that women got the vote fully. That string of time, my friends, is 713 years. Is Iran on a progressive path since the 79 revolution? What timeline are we measuring it against? We tend to measure progress in our lifetime. If things haven't worked out quite well in the Middle East, then we think it's a great failure. And sometimes we've just got to take the long view when it comes to progress.
In comparative terms, there is progress in the West, and this debate is called Tears of the West. Is it, do you think, in that sense, something that we should be more optimistic about? Let me put that first to Arlie. Do you think that this is something where we need to just be more comparative in terms of where benefit is and where progress is?
No. I think, again, thinking about the people that I've been talking to in Appalachia, they compare their fate to people in India. Not very much, but they compare it to people in China. And they say, hey, the Chinese have our jobs. Those are our jobs. And we have to go back. This goes back a little bit to what Rory was saying. I think we have to look at what people feel proud of and what they feel ashamed of, that we have to go back to those feelings because they are proud of having a job, not just men, but that to have a job is hugely important. And in many of these regions, actually labor force participation is going down. Region I'm looking at is half of people have jobs. So they're not proud, they're ashamed. And I think Donald Trump has come right on into the shame market and has said, look, we'll make America great again. Listen to that again. And he's like a Baptist preacher, you are so low down, we have crime, but I will raise you up. And they're eager for some raise up here. It's magical, Rory, but it's better than anything else they're hearing from the Democrats or anybody else.
You might also argue that the left has dropped the ball in that its traditional role in espousing the reallocation of resources has been abandoned in favor of effectively a kind of identity politics, which is about status rather than about material conditions. Now, my problem with that is that there are many, many ways, trust me, that you can make people give you money or even redistribute money and make them feel good about doing so. There is no way in which you can make someone feel good about losing status. And so by turning things into a sort of status and identity war, which is a negative sum game, away from a perfectly healthy focus on redistribution of the gains, they've effectively abandoned what would their old position and left a vacuum.
I agree with that.
Sorry, let me bring Angus in on this. And one point I wanted to push with that, Angus, was that in this comparison, which I'm trying to move towards, comparison with the West and the rest, if one can use those terms, there are reasons for thinking, perhaps not purely economically, but in social terms, that there has been progress, that women's rights, that LGBT rights, that all sorts of ways of dealing with mental health, say, as opposed to physical health, improved dramatically, and in comparison are much better in the West than they are in those other places.
That's certainly true, but I challenge you to go and talk to one of the people that Arlie's working with and tell them that, you're okay, because there are people in China and people in Bolivia who are much worse off than you. And they say, are those the bastards that just took my jobs from the factory that closed down around here? Right? Mm-hmm. And we have been making that comparison to them for far too long. And we say, you're not really poor. These people in India and China are much, much poorer than you are. So if you lose their job to them, that's a good thing, because we're in favor of cosmopolitan redistribution, not just redistribution within the United States. And boy, has that been a catastrophe. We've got to stop saying that. I was at the World Bank last week and telling them, they're cosmopolitans in that sense, and that's the way they think. And I think they're maybe right to think that, but they have a constraint, which is they're living in Washington, D.C., and they're going to get overrun by Donald Trump and his friends if they don't back off that position. So I don't actually think that that's much comfort to the people hurting to tell them that they're better off than someone they've never met in a far distant country.
What about to tell them that they are freer, that they are more able to express their views, that they're able to vote, and the vote means something? Is that not something that they could see as an advantage?
Well, I'm sure they do see as an advantage, but I don't think it's a comparative advantage. I think it's an absolute advantage. And, one of the problems with these people in the US is that their power has been taken away from them forever. I mean, you've had a whole series of democratic administrations that have governed as if they were Wall Street, right?
Yeah.
And they've been happy to take rents from those people while mouthing off platitudes about how much better they are than people who live in India. There's another literature which you and your listeners may not know about, but I think is very important. And this is something I changed my mind on too. There are people, many of them at Princeton, Kathy Eden and Matt Desmond, people who've written about extreme poverty in the US. And I'm not at all convinced that the pockets of real poverty in the US are not in their way much worse than the poverty that exists in India, which I know very well, and in much of Africa, which I know very well too.
Why worse? Why would you say it was worse?
Well, for one thing, the World Bank is doing these conversions wrong. So it's much, much, much more expensive to live here than the conventional comparisons will do. But also, once you start thinking about community failure, you think about family failure, you think about people. You can live a good life in a village in India with very low material well-being. And it's much harder to do that. So, when Kathy Eden's talking to people in the Mississippi Delta who are selling their children's social security numbers in order to, make ends meet, that people should read those books before they start talking about, and I don't agree with everything that's in there, but there's desperate poverty in the US. And you could argue the relativity the other way, that desperate poverty in a land of plenty is a much greater disgrace than desperate poverty in a land where everyone's poor.
There's an H.L. Mencken quote, which is, "A rich man is anyone who earns more than his wife's sister's husband." And if you update the gender, effectively people's perception of wealth and the extent to which it contributes to well-being is highly contextualized. Making the comparison with other continents, it doesn't play.
Yeah, Arlie, can I bring you in with a question I wanted to put, which is following on further on this thing that are we purely measuring, as we seem to be, by wealth, which is obviously important, but more than that, is there a way in which we have made progress in so many other social areas, and that is a comparison that needs to be made, obviously, as well as the poverty that we're talking about?
Well, I'd like to take your question in a different direction, if I may. I feel like what we're not looking at that's staring us in the face is the emotion of pride and shame. And that shame gets attached to being detached from the economic machine, from not having, not feeling proud as a worker or proud as a member of a community, to go what Angus was saying. Being isolated, that becomes shameful. And I think we have to go back from shame to looking at losses. We're not looking at losses. There are three kinds of loss that I've seen among people who are red state, MAGA state. One is absolute loss. You can count that. I had a job digging coal, now it's gone. Absolute loss. But then there's depreciation. You have something, but it's worth less than it was. There's a kind of a knowledge you had that no longer matters. And then you have to move to a new job, and all your local knowledge about who lives where in the holler or who knew you, oh, you're Tom's son, all of that is now devalued, depreciated, of no use to you. And the third is kind of relative loss. You can't turn on the tube without being compared to people who are better off. Advertising, of course, is a great source of comparison for people. Oh, I don't live there. I couldn't go there for a summer holiday. So those three kinds of losses have been covered over. And the feelings you have about those losses also covered over. So for the new definition of the American dream, or new notion of what our, what we should feel proud of, is to uncover those things and answer those losses. Don't suppress them.
If we can answer them, which I guess, Rory, is the problem, because a lot of those losses are, in a way, unaddressable. And I mean, I want to add an extra loss that maybe is there too, which is perhaps security in financial terms, certainly.
Yes.
But more generally, security about many things in life that perhaps were more certain before. And I suppose we should include in that a sense of international security, which we know is somewhat troubled at the moment. Is that part of the problem with saying we are making progress still?